Hey everyone. Tonight we're leaving the frantic, noisy world of the present behind. We are going to explore the curious, frozen history of the great frosts, specifically those rare, shivering winters when the River Thames in London decided to stop being a river entirely and became instead a solid limestone-colored highway of ice. It's a story of survival, of strange royal whims, and the sheer human audacity to build a carnival on top of a frozen abyss. So just breathe, let the day go, and let's wander onto the ice. It's the winter of 1683. Now, usually the Thames is a temperamental, muddy stretch of water, full of coal barges and the occasional disgruntled swan. But this year, the Little Ice Age is in full swing, and nature has decided to be particularly dramatic. By December, the river isn't just cold, it's immobile. The water has thickened, groaned, and finally locked into place. And because Londoners have always been a people who see a catastrophe and think, I could probably sell some gin there, they didn't flee the ice. No, they moved onto it. They built a city on top of the water, because of course they did. Imagine waking up in a drafty wooden house in 17th century London. The glass in your window is frosted over with patterns so thick you can't see the street. You can hear the timber of your own house creaking as the frost expands. You wrap yourself in every layer of wool you own, none of it particularly clean, but all of it necessary. You step outside, and instead of the usual slop of the streets, you find a world turned white and silent. You walk down to the bank of the river, and where there should be splashing and the shouting of watermen, there is only a vast, jagged plain of ice stretching from bank to bank. It wasn't a smooth skating rink, mind you. This was a chaotic landscape of frozen chunks, some the size of wagons, all fused together into a treacherous, bone-chilling floor. And yet, there are streets, actual streets of booths and tents lined up in neat rows. They called it Friesland Street. There are taverns on the ice, because naturally the first thing a Londoner needs when the world is ending is a pint of ale and a place to complain about the government. Let's drift through the crowds. The air is thick with the smell of roasting ox, an entire ox turning on a spit right over the ice. You'd think the heat would melt the floor and send everyone into the dark, freezing depths, but the ice is nearly a foot thick. It's a literal foundation. There are printing presses set up on the river, where you can pay a sixpence to have your name printed on a souvenir card, proving you stood on the Thames in the year of the Great Frost. King Charles II did it himself. He took the whole royal family out there. Imagine the scene. The King of England, known for his love of spaniels and complicated mistresses, sliding across the ice to watch a bull baiting match. It's absurd, it's slightly dangerous, and it's perfectly historical. But while the elites were treating the ice like a playground, the reality for everyone else was a bit more crunchy. Inside the royal palaces, things weren't much better. Even with massive stone fireplaces, the wine was freezing in the decanters. Imagine being a high-ranking duke trying to look dignified while your expensive French claret has turned into a purple popsicle. The ink froze in the wells. Philosophers were trying to write about the nature of the soul, only to find their quills stuck in a block of ice. It's hard to be a great thinker when your primary concern is whether or not your toes are still attached to your feet. As we linger on the ice, you might see a carriage driving across. That was the real novelty. People paid good money to be driven from Westminster to the Temple in a horse-drawn coach right over the water. It was faster than the congested streets of the city, and arguably more fun, assuming the horse didn't lose its footing. There were puppet shows, football games, and even a honeymoon tent. It was a carnival of the cold, a temporary civilization built on a literal whim of the weather. And then there was the silence. Beyond the noise of the fair, the rest of the country was under a blanket of white so deep that travel simply stopped. The post didn't move. The mills couldn't grind corn because the water wheels were frozen. In the countryside, the birds were falling out of the trees, literal little feathered ice cubes. It was a beautiful, terrifying stillness. But for now, just focus on the flickering light of the braziers on the river, the low hum of voices, the smell of wood smoke and old wool. It's a cold world, but you are warm. You are just an observer, drifting over the frozen Thames, watching a king and his court play pretend on a river that will eventually wake up and wash it all away. But that's a problem for the spring. For now, the ice is solid, the world is quiet, and we can move on to the next frozen moment in time. Moving south toward France, we're headed for the Palace of Versailles, the most glittering, golden, and notoriously drafty monument to one man's ego ever constructed. The year is 1709, and the Great Winter has arrived. This wasn't just a cold snap, this was a continental disaster. It was so cold that the salt water of the Mediterranean froze. The bells in the church towers cracked when they were rung, and inside the Hall of Mirrors, King Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, was finding out that even a god king cannot command the thermometer. King Louis was a man who enjoyed control. He liked his gardens symmetrical, his courtiers obedient, and his ankles showcased in very expensive stockings. But in 1709, the Sun King was losing his warmth. Versailles, for all its gold leaf and marble, was essentially a giant stone refrigerator. There was no insulation. The ceilings were high enough to house small clouds, and the windows were beautiful, expansive, and entirely useless at keeping out a Siberian gale. Imagine being a courtier during this winter. To be in the king's presence was the highest honor, but in 1709, that honor came with a side of hypothermia. You'd be standing in a long gallery dressed in silk and lace, fabrics that provide the thermal protection of a wet paper towel, trying not to let your teeth chatter while the king discussed the latest military failures in the War of Spanish Succession. The king sat at his great table, surrounded by his family. This was a man who ate off solid gold plates. But during the Great Winter, the food would arrive from the kitchens, which were half a mile away because heaven forbid the king smell the cooking, and by the time it reached the royal table, the sauces had congealed into a cold, greasy film. There are accounts of the king's wine freezing in the glass between sips. He would reach for a goblet of Burgundy and find a solid block of ice. It's a wonderful dry irony, isn't it? The most powerful man in Europe sitting in a house that cost a significant portion of the national GDP, and he can't even have a liquid drink. The courtiers were desperate. They began wearing muffs made of fur, not just on their hands, but hanging from their waists. Some of the ladies were rumored to be wearing 3 or 4 fur-lined petticoats, making them look like velvet bells as they waddled through the frozen corridors. The firewood was running low, and what was left was damp. The chimneys smoked, filling the gilded rooms with a gray, stinging haze. So you had the French elite, covered in diamonds and soot, huddled around flickering embers, wondering if the world was actually ending. King Louis, of course, tried to maintain his dignity. He was the Sun King. But even he eventually retreated to his private apartments, where he had smaller rooms that were slightly easier to heat. He spent his days wrapped in heavy quilts, clutching a foot warmer, a little box of hot coals, while his doctors argued about the cold was caused by a misalignment of the stars or a surplus of phlegm in the atmosphere. Naturally, their solution for everything was to bleed the patient, which, when you're already shivering in a sub-zero bedroom, seems like a particularly poor choice. Outside the palace gates, the situation was far more grim. The wheat had frozen in the ground. The fruit trees were splitting open with a sound like pistol shots as the sap turned to ice. Famine was creeping in. But inside Versailles, the main concern was the etiquette of the fireplace. There were strict rules about who could sit near the fire. If you weren't of a certain rank, you stood in the shadows, slowly turning into a statue, while a duke toasted his backside. It's a strange image to hold in your mind. The pinnacle of European sophistication, reduced to a group of shivering, hungry aristocrats in a dark, smoky palace. The music of Lully and Couperin was replaced by the sound of coughing and the wind howling through the cracks in the casements. But as the night deepens, let's leave the Sun King to his frozen wine. Let's drift away from the smoky halls of Versailles and move further east, where the winters are even longer, the palaces even larger, and the royalty, well, significantly more eccentric. Let's drift further east now, across the frozen plains of Poland and into the heart of Russia. If you thought the French were struggling with the cold, the Russians were in their element, though element in this case means a level of winter that feels less like a season and more like a personal vendetta from nature. We've arrived in St. Petersburg, the city built on a swamp by Peter the Great, a man who essentially willed the capital into existence through sheer stubbornness. But it's 1740, and the throne is occupied by her niece, Empress Anna Ivanovna. Empress Anna was a complicated woman. She was a fan of heavy jewelry, German advisors, and a brand of cruelty that was so creative it almost bordered on performance art. She was often bored, and as any historian will tell you, a bored Romanov with absolute power is a recipe for a very strange Tuesday. During the winter of 1740, which was particularly brutal even by Russian standards, Anna decided to celebrate the season by commissioning something truly unique, a palace made entirely of ice. Now, when I say entirely, I mean it. This wasn't just a fancy igloo, it was a full-scale neoclassical villa, 30 feet high and 80 feet wide, constructed from massive blocks of ice cut from the Neva River. The blocks were squared with such precision that they were joined together using nothing but water, which acted as an instant frozen mortar. The walls were translucent, shimmering with a ghostly pale blue light during the day and glowing like a massive lantern at night when thousands of candles were lit inside. But the architecture was only the beginning of the absurdity. The Empress insisted that everything inside the palace also be made of ice. There were ice chairs, ice tables, and an ice bed with ice pillows and an ice quilt carved to look like soft fabric. There were ice clocks that didn't tick, ice commodes that were, thankfully, purely decorative, and even a pair of ice slippers. On the dining table, there were plates of food carved from ice and painted to look like real delicacies. It was the ultimate look but don't touch dinner party. Outside the palace, the madness continued. There were ice trees with ice birds perched in their branches and a life-size ice elephant that actually sprayed water from its trunk using a hidden pump. According to the chronicles, the elephant sometimes sprayed fire at night, which was achieved by pumping naphtha through it. Because if you've already built an ice elephant, you might as well make it breathe fire. It's only logical. However, the real reason this story survives in the darker corners of history wasn't just the architecture. It was what Anna did with it. She decided to use the palace as the setting for a mock wedding. She chose one of her court jesters, a disgraced prince named Mikhail Golitsyn, and forced him to marry an aging, unattractive maidservant she nicknamed Buzhanina, which was the name of a popular Russian roast pork dish. The wedding was a parade of humiliation. The couple was forced to ride in a cage on the back of an elephant, followed by a procession of people from every corner of the Russian Empire, dressed in traditional costumes and riding everything from camels to sleds pulled by dogs. After a night of forced celebration, the couple was marched into the ice palace and told they had to spend their wedding night on the ice bed. To ensure they didn't try to escape and find actual warmth, the Empress stationed guards at the doors. Imagine the sheer, bone-chilling terror of that night, lying on a slab of frozen river water, surrounded by walls of ice, while the temperature outside dropped to 30 degrees below zero. It's a miracle they survived, though legend says Buzhanina had managed to smuggle in a heavy fur coat by bribing one of the guards. Anna watched the whole thing with the detached curiosity of a child playing with dolls. To her, the ice palace was a triumph of the human will over nature, a glittering frozen toy. But, as is the way with all things made of ice, the sun eventually returned. As the spring of 1741 arrived, the elephant stopped breathing fire. The clocks melted into puddles, and the palace simply slid back into the Neva River from whence it came. Anna herself passed away later that year, leaving behind a legacy of shivering courtiers and a very cold bed. Let the image of that glowing, translucent palace fade now. The blue light is dimming. The fire-breathing elephant is silent. We're moving away from the Russian frost, drifting back toward the west, toward a royal family that was perhaps more genetically consistent than was strictly healthy. We find ourselves now in Madrid, at the Alcázar Palace. It is the late 17th century, the era of the Spanish Habsburgs, a dynasty that had spent so many centuries marrying their own cousins that their family tree was essentially a vertical line. We are here to visit Charles II of Spain, often called the Bewitched. Charles was a man who seemed to be made of glass and bad luck. He had the famous Habsburg jaw, so pronounced that he couldn't properly chew his food, and a tongue so large he could barely speak. He was the end of a line, a physical manifestation of a dynasty that had run out of steam. And in the winters of Madrid, which are surprisingly sharp and dry, Charles was a man who lived in a perpetual shiver. The Spanish court was governed by etiquette, a set of rules so rigid they made the French court look like a casual backyard barbecue. In the Spanish court, everything was slow, everything was formal. If the king was cold, there was a specific official whose job it was to bring a blanket. If that official wasn't in the room, the king simply sat there and froze. There is a famous, possibly apocryphal story of a previous Spanish king who sat too close to a brazier. Because the Grand Master of the household wasn't available to move the heater, the king supposedly allowed his legs to be scorched rather than violate protocol. Charles II spent his winters wrapped in layers of black velvet, the traditional color of the Spanish court. He wandered through the vast, gloomy halls of the Alcázar, followed by a procession of dwarf entertainers and monks. He was a deeply superstitious man, convinced that his physical ailments were the result of sorcery rather than several generations of uncle-niece marriages. During the coldest nights, Charles would often retreat to the royal pantheon, the underground tomb where his ancestors were buried. He would have the coffins opened so he could look at the remains of his father and his ancestors, seeking some kind of comfort from the cold, silent dead. It's a haunting image, a frail, pale king in a black velvet suit standing in a candlelit tomb in the middle of a Madrid winter, surrounded by the dust of a dying empire. His meals were equally somber. Because of his jaw, he mostly ate broths and soft foods, served to him on silver platters by kneeling nobles who weren't allowed to look him in the eye. The dining hall was vast and impossible to heat, so the king ate his lukewarm soup while the wind whistled through the tapestries, making the embroidered hunters and stags look like they were shivering along with him. But even in this atmosphere of decay and cold, there was a certain dignity to the Habsburg winter. There was the ritual of the midnight cocoa, a thick, spicy chocolate drink brought from the New World, served in delicate porcelain cups. Let's drift one last time, moving into the heart of Central Europe, to the snow-dusted spires of Prague. We are entering the Hratiany Castle, the sprawling, labyrinthine seat of Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor. The year is 1600, right at the dawn of the century that would become the coldest in human memory. Rudolf was perhaps the most sleepless historian of all monarchs, a man who hated the sun, loathed politics, and preferred the company of alchemists, astronomers, and clockmakers to that of his own generals. Rudolf's winters were not spent in ballrooms. He spent them in his Kunstkammer, his cabinet of curiosities, a series of vaulted rooms filled with the strange and the beautiful. While his empire crumbled and his relatives plotted to replace him because he was unfit to rule, which in Habsburg terms usually just meant he wasn't interested in starting enough wars, Rudolf was busy examining a preserved mermaid's hand or watching the gears of a mechanical universe turn. The atmosphere in the castle during a Bohemian winter was one of heavy golden gloom. Prague is a city of mists, and in the winter, the fog from the Vltava River climbs the hill and swallows the castle whole. Rudolf loved it. He would sit by a massive green-tiled stove, the kind that stayed warm for days, surrounded by his collection. There were celestial globes made of silver, automated clocks where tiny golden figures of death would strike the hour, and paintings by Arcimboldo, those strange portraits where a man's face is made entirely of winter vegetables or frozen fish. Imagine the sound of 1,000 clocks ticking at once in a silent, snowy castle. It's a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat. Rudolf would sit there, wrapped in fur-lined robes, staring at a beaker of liquid gold an alchemist had promised would grant him eternal life. He was a man obsessed with the idea that the world was a giant machine, and if he could just find the right key, he could wind it back to a time of peace. Outside his door, the world was anything but peaceful. His brother Matthias was slowly stealing his crown, and the religious tensions that would lead to the 30 Years' War were simmering like a pot about to boil over. But Rudolf just turned another gear on a clock. He was a master of productive procrastination. When a diplomat arrived to discuss urgent border disputes, Rudolf would often force them to look at his collection of rare tulips or his favorite pet lion. Naturally, the diplomats found this infuriating. There is a quiet, lonely beauty to Rudolf's winter. He would walk through his private observatory at night, looking through the telescopes of Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler. The stars are never clearer than they are on a sub-zero night in Prague. He wasn't looking for God, he was looking for patterns. He wanted the universe to make sense, even if his own life didn't. As the night grew deepest, Rudolf would feed his menagerie. He kept eagles, lions, and exotic birds in the castle moats and gardens. There is something deeply melancholic about the image of Emperor alone in the freezing moonlight, tossing meat to a shivering lion, while the rest of Europe waited for him to make a decision he would never make. Eventually, the Winter King would be forced out and the gears of his clocks would stop turning. But for now, in our story, the fire in the green-tiled stove is still glowing. The alchemist's beaker is still bubbling softly. Rudolph is still leaning over a map of the stars, safe in his world of curiosities. The cold of the Thames, the frost of Versailles, the ice of St. Petersburg, and the shadows of Madrid, they all settle now. The great winters of the past are just echoes. The kings and queens, with all their petty meltdowns and grand delusions, are long gone, their breath no longer visible in the freezing air. The world is still. The ice is thick and silent. You are safe, you are warm, and the history of the world is tucked away for the night. Before we return to the ticking clocks of Prague, let's drift even further into the biting wind, moving toward the edge of the known world. We are traveling to the jagged, pine-covered coast of Sweden in the year 1718. We've come to see King Charles XII, not the shivering Charles of Spain, but the Carolus Rex, a man who lived as if he were made of iron and spite. While other kings were being tucked into bed with heated bricks, Charles XII was leading an army through the Norwegian mountains in the middle of a blizzard because he simply refused to believe that weather applied to him. Charles was the ultimate minimalist monarch. He hated finery. He wore a simple blue soldier's coat, slept on a haystack or the bare ground, and ate dry bread soaked in water. In the height of the great winter, while his generals were begging him to retreat to a warm palace, Charles was busy showing off. There are stories of him sleeping outside in a snowdrift just to prove a point to his shivering grenadiers. He was a man who saw a frozen landscape and didn't see a tragedy. He saw a tactical advantage. Imagine the sensory world of a Swedish army camp in the deep midwinter. The air is so cold it feels like breathing in needles. The only sound is the rhythmic thwack of axes against frozen timber as soldiers try to build fires that the wind immediately snuffs out. The horses are covered in thick hoarfrost, looking like ghostly statues. And in the center of it all is the king, sitting on a wooden stool, staring at a map while his fingers turn blue. He didn't care. He had a boring obsession with duty that overrode his own biology. But nature has a way of humbling even the most stubborn kings. This was the era of the Carolean Death March. Imagine thousands of soldiers trying to cross the mountains back to Sweden, caught in a storm so violent they couldn't see the man in front of them. They weren't dying in battle, they were simply stopping. One by one, men would sit down in the snow, overwhelmed by a sudden peaceful sleepiness, the sweet death of hypothermia. When the spring finally thawed the passes, they found hundreds of soldiers still standing or sitting in a circle, frozen perfectly in place like a macabre museum exhibit. Back in his headquarters, Charles would receive reports of these losses with a terrifying stoicism. He'd just take a sip of melted snow and order the next march. He was the Winter King in the most literal sense, a man whose heart seemed as cold as the glaciers he climbed. He represents that strange, hard edge of history where human stubbornness meets the absolute wall of the elements. As we leave the Iron King of the North, notice how the blue of his coat fades into the gray mist of the mountains. The sound of the howling Norwegian wind is beginning to change. It's becoming softer, more rhythmic. It's shifting into the sound of gears, of springs, and of 1,000 tiny hammers striking bells. We are leaving the frozen mountains and drifting back to the golden gloom of Prague, where another emperor is waiting for us, safely tucked away behind his castle walls. Before we settle back into the ticking silence of Prague, let's make one final stop where the cold was never supposed to reach. We are drifting south and east, away from the pine forests of Sweden, across the black waters of the Danube to the domed skyline of Constantinople. Here, in the heart of the Ottoman Empire, the winter of 1709 has pulled off the impossible. It has brought the Little Ice Age to the gates of the Topkapi Palace. We've come to see Sultan Ahmed III, a man who reigned over a world of tulips, silk, and sprawling summer gardens, but who is currently finding out that marble floors are essentially just slabs of frozen regret. Imagine the Bosphorus, the great artery of the world, choked with jagged ice flows. People are actually walking across the water from Galata to Istanbul. For a city that lives by the sea, this is more than a weather event, it's a cosmic glitch. Inside the palace, the atmosphere is one of gilded panic. The Ottomans were masters of luxury, but their architecture was designed for a Mediterranean breeze, not a polar vortex. The vast open courtyards and high-domed ceilings, meant to circulate cool air in August, were now effectively giant funnels for the freezing northern wind. Ahmed III was a refined man. He loved poetry, calligraphy, and his legendary tulip festivals. But in 1709, the tulips are frozen deep in the black earth, and the Sultan is retreating through his labyrinthine harem, seeking the one thing that gold cannot buy, a room without a draft. The imperial silk robes, usually light and breathable, have been replaced by heavy furs from Siberia. Imagine the Sultan, the shadow of God on earth, sitting on a velvet divan, wrapped in so many layers of sable and ermine that he looks less like a monarch and more like a very expensive bear. The atmosphere here is a strange mix of the exotic and the Arctic. The smell of expensive oud and rosewater is mingling with the sharp, acrid smoke of charcoal braziers. Slaves are constantly scurrying through the halls, carrying silver mangal, portable heaters, to place at the Sultan's feet. But marble is a stubborn material. It drinks the cold and refuses to let it go. You can hear the constant rhythmic clinking of coffee cups. The Ottomans drank their coffee thick, dark, and scaldingly hot, clinging to the porcelain for warmth as much as the caffeine. But the most surreal sight is in the gardens. Ahmed had a famous collection of exotic birds and tortoises. During his summer parties, he would place candles on the shells of the tortoises and let them wander through the tulip beds like living lanterns. In the great winter, these gardens are a graveyard of ice. The lemon trees are encased in translucent shells, their fruit looking like preserved jewels. The fountains have frozen mid-spray, forming jagged, glittering sculptures that no artist could replicate. Back in his palace walls, the common people are huddling in coffee houses, debating whether this cold is a sign of the end of days. The wood supply is dwindling, and the price of coal has skyrocketed. But inside the palace, the Sultan is trying to maintain the illusion of a perpetual spring. He commissions poets to write about the silver blossoms of the frost, trying to frame the disaster as a beautiful aesthetic choice. It's a classic royal move. If you can't beat the winter, pretend you invited it. But even as the coffee steams and the charcoal glows, the cold remains. It's a reminder that no matter how many tulips you plant or how much silk you weave, the earth has its own rhythm. The Sultan takes a sip of his coffee, stares out at the frozen Bosphorus, and waits for the sun to return to his empire. As we leave the domes of Istanbul, the smell of wood smoke and coffee begins to thin. The warmth of the braziers fades into a cooler, drier air. We are moving back toward the center of the map, toward a land of deep forests and mountain mists. The heavy silence of the Ottoman winter is being replaced by something more intricate. A tick, a talk, a soft metallic chime. We are finally returning to Prague, to the emperor who has spent his whole life trying to turn the world into a clock, hoping that if he can just keep the gears moving, the winter will never have to end.